part 2 of the Midrash Rabbah 2.0. This is Parasha Bo, and my question is there something in your life right now that is causing you to look outward instead of inward? When we as humans read Exodus, we are plagued with a very unfortunate reality. That reality is that we are actually given the whole story. Furthermore, we are unfortunately plagued with the reality that it is a story. It is a narrative that we read. It is post-action recordings of what happened. Most of the parasha is written in third-person masculine singular completed action or perfect. In other words, it's already done. And so we have a tendency to not focus on or realize the importance of its effect on our lives right now. So one of the questions that I actually asked the congregation during lunch, because we got on a Zoom call during lunch, and I said, hey guys, I said, why aren't the feast days lined up with Torah? Let me explain. Number one is that we don't go from the Passover to Shavuot to Tabernacles. We go from the Passover to Shavuot to a whole bunch of stuff, and we don't even encounter Tabernacles until long after David. In fact, I think the first keeping of the Tabernacles is actually in Josiah's life. Maybe it was Hezekiah's life. Either way, the point being is that you would think that the Torah would contain something about tabernacles. We go from Passover to Pentecost. How do we know Pentecost? Because we know the amount of time it took to get to Sinai was the 50-day count plus the time it took to get to the Red Sea, which is Passover to Pentecost. We know that Pentecost was the giving of Torah, not to Israel, but to the nations. And that Israel was commissioned as ambassadors to the kingdom of heaven on that day. We know that from Pentecost to Tabernacles, the golden calf occurs. But then there's no tabernacles. Now, that's question number one, is why doesn't Torah line up that way? Why does Torah stop and not give us tabernacles? In fact, truth be told, is we don't get tabernacles until, for those of you who read the 66 book compendium instead of, say, the JPS Tanakh, book of Revelation. We don't actually get to see that wedding week until the book of Revelation. And truth be told, is what tabernacles has become for the Jewish people is absolutely pathetic compared to Passover and the sacred keeping of Yom Kippur. There's greater honor given to a non-prescription feast day than to a prescription feast day. Tabernacles has been forgotten. In fact, it was replaced by Christmas. Tabernacles is not present. Well, I can propose to you that the golden calf plays a huge role in that. But what I want to throw out there is, even if we were to follow the narrative, let's just say that tabernacles was in Torah somewhere contained after Pentecost. And so we could see a progressive movement from Passover to Pentecost to Tabernacles without any interruption. Some were saying maybe in Deuteronomy. It wouldn't matter. Because why? Because Torah is off from the feast days. We're studying Passover in January, not after the barley has been made aviv and the new moon observed, and 14 days after that, at twilight, the lamb is slaughtered. Why? I propose to you that there is built into everything tikkun. And I propose to you that, and for those of you who don't know what tikkun is, it is a rectification or a repair or a return on investment. I'll give you an example of a tikkun. There were 3,000 people killed after the golden calf incident. There were 3,000 people baptized at the Feast of Pentecost, or after the Feast of Pentecost, I should say, in the book of Acts. Now, for those of you who don't read the book of Acts, for those of you who don't believe that Yeshua is your Messiah, obviously there's a little bit more of a hurdle for you to get over with that information. And you may not find a tikkun for the golden calf. However, this is much I can say, is that a tikkun is basically a repair of the breach. Remember, in Ezekiel chapter 22, at the end of it, it says that Yahweh went to and fro looking for someone who would stand in the gap to repair the wall, and could find none. And of course, back in the day, we had the Promise Keepers stand in the gap, which was a conference in Washington, D.C. And I can tell you that the principle is that basically, however it works out, what we're looking at and what we're working with here is a concept of there being a built-in mechanism in the world of interaction with God, of mercy. Now, here's an interesting thing. Ezra is actually the person who actually is the mechanism of the mechanism of return after the exile, and he brings with him this wisdom of organization within the exile, of documenting things, making sure that the temple stuff makes it back to Jerusalem. But then he does something else. He adds to the people Torah as a weekly information brought in. And what that does is that offers to the people an opportunity to learn Torah and understand Torah while they're in their daily operations, thereby fulfilling the part of the Shema that says, you shall speak about them when you are in the public and when you are in private, right? So it's interesting because within that construct, he creates the parashas. And what I mean is that when he constructed the whole parasha set and the reading in the marketplace and the teachings on Shabbat, even James was smart enough to understand that the people who were coming into Torah through Yeshua were not going to have to just jump straight into an stringent understanding of Torah like the rabbis were demanding that they would do, but instead that they would just stop hurting people and animals and doing nasty things. And they would, what, in Acts chapter 15, verse 21, go to the synagogue, learn from the preaching of Moses from ancient times. Well, that's Ezra who created that. But when he did it under divine inspiration. What I mean by that is he was not obviously connected to his soul, but he was tapping into divine provision within it and guidance. Not necessarily like, thy will be done, but instead more of like, hey, I know you know a little bit more about what these people need. Give me wisdom on how to construct this. And he told him to construct the parashas in such a way that Passover is early. You see, he could have lined everything up. He could have took the story of the Passover and sucked it into the date of the Passover. But he didn't. It's way out here. Passover's here. This is here. This study that we're doing right now is not in the spring. It's in the winter. It's in the realm of death. It's in the sowing season, which the sowing season is designed to expose your stinginess. And the sowing season is designed to expose your secret desire to return to your vomit. That's right. There is a concept of the sowing season actually being a warning about what's to come.
Well, last week you talked about the light of Passover, right? So it makes sense to me that we would be in this season so before it's time in order to understand. Because if information and understanding is kind of like hindsight 2020, then you would need to have gone through a season of it in order to understand it, right? And right now we're going through this season of Passover before it's time in order to understand what it is that we need to understand when we go through it.
And that's the key here. You know, when Yahweh was creating the heavens and the earth, he started to create humans. He started discussing what he wanted to do with the humans. The angels came to him and appealed to him and said, if you create this Torah that you're talking about, this universal law, as it were, the humans, because you're giving them free will and you're creating the frailty in which they will be created, in other words, the interdependence that he wanted to have with them required them to be independent to begin with, that they would become so bogged down in judgment that they would die before they ever achieved any light. And Yahweh said, yes, that would be true, except I've already created this. And he reveals he already had created Tikkun. He had already made the way for there to be a clear conscience upon the mistakes made. Now, in that light, we view this parasha being read now during the wilderness season, in which I know that there has been awakened within you some really difficult stuff. And I think it's important that we understand that the reason why that awakening has occurred is because we crossed that threshold from more darkness than light into a little bit more light than darkness as we move closer and closer to the Passover. We get closer and closer to the light of Passover. Things are starting to become apparent because it's not the kindness or it's not the wrath of God that leads us to repentance, but the kindness of God. A shock to the system. Why would you be kind to me? Why would you have mercy on me? Pharaoh didn't recognize that. He didn't recognize that Moses, his God, had prayed to Yahweh that he would be delivered from the locust. Pharaoh didn't recognize that he had a distinction made between the land of Goshen and the land of Egypt with the plague of darkness, which consequently was pointed out to me during lunch, that in the book of Revelation there's a plague of darkness and they experience pain. Darkness comes over the land and they have pain, and they experience anguish. And furthermore, there's a reference in Revelation that darkness was the result of the fact that it did not repent, which stands to reason that same tool would be used here in Egypt. And I propose to you that something interesting happens in the book of Zechariah, chapter 14. The plagues that would fall upon the people who did not bring tribute to the temple during the Feast of Tabernacles, the nations that remained were the plagues of Egypt. And very specifically, that rain would not fall, which is where we get the water ceremony, which is where we get Yeshua standing up and saying, anybody who thirsts, let them come unto me and I'll give you living waters and you'll never thirst again. Which is also when people said, oh, this is the Messiah. And some people said, no, a Messiah, how can a Messiah come from Nazareth? Nothing good comes from Nazareth. Right? And others would say, how can this guy be the Messiah? Blah, blah, blah. And of course the Pharisees are like, you can't call a man a Messiah. That's not okay. Right? The temple guard, they're like, hey, we're going to kill somebody. So it's interesting because in that confine of information, we realize that darkness was actually a very interesting plague in light of, or in lieu of, the light of Passover. And I want to just kind of for a moment say that these parashas existed before modern day Christianity was established. Ezra designed these parashas. So in that thread, a warning already existed that there would be a reaction from the nations that would be darkness concerning the light of Passover, and a reaction from Israel that would be light. You say, well, who's Israel? Oh, well, that's simple. Anyone who has been adopted and is in covenant with Yahweh through the mechanism of he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, and we might become the righteousness of God, the mechanism of unmerited light. Now, what's interesting about this is that it seems as though the same stuff went out over Egypt and over Israel. But Egypt perceived it as darkness and, by reference to Revelation, pain. But Israel perceived it as light. I want you to think about the depth.
They had light within, because it says they all had light within their houses. And if we are the house, then we should have light within, no matter the darkness that we see, no matter the darkness that is within the rest of the land.
Very good. And so, in that way, it is very important to realize that this parasha is actually a warning. But that the 9th plague was actually a reference to something that a lot of people don't know. And that is that there was only one tree in the garden, and it was how you perceived that tree that made you recognize it as the tree of life or the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Just like this last plague wasn't really a plague. Light went out from the power of the resurrection of Yeshua into that time period of Passover, but was perceived as a darkness to the Egyptians and perceived as a light to the Israelites. Goshen had light, Egypt did not. This ninth plague not only makes a distinction between that which is in the tent and that which is not in the tent, that which is in the clan and that which is without the clan, that which is within the camp and that which is without the camp, but also an understanding of perception. You see, most people say, oh, well, it's real easy. There was light in Egypt and there was not light in, or there was light in Goshen, but there was not light in Egypt. You don't understand. The same power went out. Let me prove it to you. In 325 AD, as a matter of opinion from Constantine, which I'll explain in a minute, the mechanism of Cardinal, I can't remember his name, or no, he's a bishop. He was the Bishop of Rome. There is a removal of something very important within the confines of that actual council. What I mean is this. Number one, Constantine writes a letter. You can find this in Eusebius, by the way. Constantine writes a letter to the council claiming that the Jews were a bad doctrinal influence upon the Christian people. And because of that, there needed to be a separation from what they do than what we do. And in that, they decided that the best way to separate was to, instead of keeping the Passover, and very specifically eating the Passover on the 14th of Nisan, in which believers who did eat the Passover on the 14th of Nisan were referred to as quaternarians, and very specifically the Bishop of Smyrna, Polycarp, contended with the Bishop of Rome about whether or not we should celebrate Easter as the commemoration of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, as opposed to celebrating the Passover as the death and the first fruits as the resurrection, demanded that there be a change between how the Christians did it and how the Jews did it, and therefore we would remove Passover from Christianity and replace it with the Feast of Ishtar, and then assimilate the Feast of Ishtar into the Christian religion through an acknowledgement of a resurrection that just so happens to occur in the Feast of Ishtar as well. Now, in that process, it is very important for you to understand that all of that was tied into trying to disconnect any associations with Judaism. So the Council of Nicaea at 325 AD cuts Passover, cuts the light of Passover from Christianity and replaces it with worship of God through the traditions of worship of a deity, a violation of Deuteronomy 12. You shall not learn the way the nations worship their God, and you shall not worship me the way they worship their gods. And you ever wonder why there is a Easter egg dyeing, Easter egg spoon race, and Easter egg hunt somehow pertaining to Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection.
Oh, and don't forget about the ham.
Ham is important. Yes. Sodium nitrate infused pork belly is very, very important. Very, very important.
Or the egg-laying rabbit.
The egg-laying rabbit.
How does all that pertain to?
Well, I think that might have just been Cadbury more than anything else. But anyways, the premise is that basically you need to ask yourself, Christian, why you have an Easter egg hunt at your church on Sunday morning in Christianity, and the Jew eats his Passover on the 14th of Nisan like he's commanded in the Bible. You show me where there's an Easter egg hunt commanded in the Bible. You want proof that the light of Passover has been manipulated and twisted by humanity? 325 AD. And so now you understand why the plague of darkness was no darkness. It was perceived as darkness by those who were what? Perishing. By those who were perishing. Pharaoh had already labeled them dead, and the firstborn death was coming. Egypt was dead. So now it is imperative that you as a Christian, or you as a Jew, or perhaps you as an agnostic, because I know some people watch my broadcast because of the science that I tie into it. You need to investigate the part missing from your process, because the light of Passover is starting to shine. And I will propose to you that one of the reasons why we are encountering this friction is actually because of your ego, and actually because of your guilt, and actually because of your angst. It may be that what really needs to happen here is you need to tap into that darkness. And what you need to do is start to listen to what the darkness is saying, because that's the accusation you need to overcome. You need to realize what your actual identity as a human is, that you are the light. You know why the Egyptians, because you need to understand, everybody in the entire world is the light of the world. Yeshua did not tell believing people, a people who believed he was the Messiah, that they were the light of the world. He told an unbelieving people, because everyone is the light of the world. So why did Egypt not perceive that within their own homes? Because they had a very different identity. An identity that did not contain an unmerited light. Had Israel in any way, shape, or form demonstrated that they deserved the light of Passover? No. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, so we might become the righteousness of God. What you guys don't realize is when that first lamb's throat was cut and the blood put in the bowl so that they could put it on the doorposts, Yeshua was dying at the foundations of the earth. You see, no time, no reference of space limited the power of that light. In fact, I propose to you that any visible light that we identify with is actually the light of the Passover. I know that sounds off the wall because we have the light from the sun, but the concept is that there is this mechanism of the reality of light being present as a result of what happened in the place where there is no time and space.
Right. Because what we know as the sun, as what lights up our world or as our earth, wasn't created until the fourth day. But yet we know light was created on the first day.
Right. So look at you referencing Genesis in the image of God.
So the light that we consider is something completely different than what we believe lights our earth.
Indeed. Okay. So why is it so important? It's so important because this particular parasha, Bo, is a warning. But what does Bo mean? Go into. So go into what? Go into yourself and experience the Passover of Torah within yourself as a story to awaken your soul to its disconnect from Passover. See, you don't realize that there are two connections required. One, the human needs to be disconnected from the ego and connected to the soul. Number two, the soul needs to be connected to the light of the Creator. The light of the Creator is the light of Passover. The light of Passover is the light of the Messiah. Meaning what? Joseph had a light of the Messiah within him and delivered Egypt from plagues. Moses had that same light, but Egypt was not delivered because of Pharaoh's heart. One Pharaoh allows them to have privilege over the rest of the people in their experience with the plagues. One Pharaoh retaliates upon the people when his land experiences the plagues. What a powerful compare-contrast. But now I'm going to take it a step further and tell you that the difference between the Passover that happens in March or April and the Passover that's happening now in this parasha is the difference between the external locus of control and the internal locus of control. Let me explain. So the whole idea is that at the time of the Passover in March, your heart, regardless of its condition, is commanded to acknowledge the Passover lamb, the bitter herbs, and the unleavened bread. And if they do not, they will be cut off from their people. One of these days I will teach you what that means, but for now, you needn't know it. Instead, just follow the rules. But that's an external locus of control. That is commanding you to do it regardless of the condition of your heart. What then is this moment, this parasha, this mechanism? It is shadow work. It is letting the light begin to be revealed by uncovering that which is concealed. You see, what people don't realize is that the darkness in Egypt was a concealment of the light, which means that there was a veil. And if there was a veil, Egyptians could have passed through and experienced the light. I don't know about you, but if that kind of yuck happens in your life and you're like, oh wow, I can feel that darkness. Hey, look, there's light over there. I'm going there, right? Even if I'm an idiot, even if I am an atheist, I'm going to go over there to that light. So it says that they didn't even leave their homes. Now, I don't know if the Hebrew, in fact, we can check this real quick. I don't know if the Hebrew says they couldn't leave their homes or if it says they didn't leave their homes in the Hebrew. I know what it says in the English, right? But let's just see. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. But all the sons of Israel had light in their dwellings. So it doesn't necessarily indicate that they couldn't. It just says that they didn't. And I think, let me just double check this in the Hebrew real quick. Let me check the grammar here. Yeah, they did not arise. It says kamu, kamu, which is in the construct state of a verb, which means that it's kind of a verbal noun. So there wasn't an arising, right? The way that I want you to think about this is that the lo here, because it says lo kamu ish, a man did not rise. I'm sorry, they did not arise a man. Okay? So it says lo kamu ish. Lo is the negation particle. So it says they did arise, but then the negation particle cancels it. So it's interesting. It doesn't say they couldn't. It says they did not. They chose not to. Now, there might be some people who contend with me on that. That's fine. But the premise is that there was a veil. There was a concealment of the light of Passover, because that was definitely the light of Passover that Goshen was experiencing. There was a concealment on the light of Passover with the Egyptians. I propose that that concealment is what gave them the inability to heed the instruction to put blood on your doorpost. We've often in the past, in this ministry, studied the reality that the Egyptians, some Egyptians, put blood on their doorposts. And we have also studied within this reality that some Israelites did not.
Well, because it says it was mixed multitude, which means half some of the Egyptians actually came out of Egypt just as well as the Israelites.
That's a difficult word, mixed, but we won't get into that today. What we really need to kind of grasp here is that this death of the firstborn is coming, but that the positioning for it actually occurs in the plague of darkness, which is really scary, because then 325 AD does the same behavior. What actually followed after 325 AD? Well, I can tell you one thing. Sabbath was outlawed. In 336 AD, we have the Council of Laodicea. If anyone of the faith is caught being idle on the seventh day like the Jews are, they shall have no absolution. We can see a diminishing and death of Torah and death of the faith that Paul and Peter and John tried to seal into standard operating procedures for the next generation, stopped from what we can tell with Polycarp. Now, it doesn't mean Polycarp was a great guy or that everything about Polycarp was good. It just means that he was a quaternarian. And I propose to you that that was one of the things that what he was trying to do was preserve the proper keeping of the feasts. It may have been deviations. He may have been confused about some things. I don't know. But I can tell you the cardinal, or the bishop who eventually was made cardinal after this, the Bishop of Rome, was actually the one who argued with Polycarp, makes it to the council, and that's where the council, either by his suggestion or by more than just his suggestion, removes Passover from Christianity. And next thing, removes Sabbath. And we wonder why people in Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, felt justified in doing what they were doing to the Jews. Just like Pharaoh felt justified in doing what he was doing to the Hebrew children. Just like Herod felt justified in doing what he did to the land of Benjamin and Judah, of Bethlehem. where Rachel is so devastated by the massacre that she weeps. We don't completely know what that means, but I can tell you it was in prophecy. And the person writing the narrative of Yeshua said, thus was fulfilled. So I think it is really important here to realize that this is an inner work that is occurring with this parasha. That inner work is asking the question, how do you perceive the light of Passover? Is it an internal choice? How do you perceive not eating pork? Is it an internal choice? Do you, as a Torah observant, say, well, God said it, therefore I have to do it? Or is there a heart towards it? Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking that internal work, looking at whether you see the light or whether you see darkness, and whether you decide to arise. I love that word, that it's actually saying that it's arise. Whether you decide to arise from that darkness and move into an area of light. I think that's a great, when we look at, okay, why is Passover, why is Bo during this January season when Passover doesn't come until March or April? This is why, because we need to understand this season before we can enter into the light of Passover.
It is really important for you guys to understand. Our reality that we perceive in front of us is so misunderstood that any warning from the supernatural realm should be heeded with gravity. Now, I'm not dooming and glooming it here. And I'm not saying that woe is you and the death of the firstborn is coming. What I'm saying is we don't understand this physical reality the way that we are supposed to, and we don't perceive it that way. We don't operate within the confines of who we really are. I have this crazy question for you, because a lot of people think that Israel was established as a nation when they were delivered from Egypt. Did the covenant with Yahweh and Jacob end because Jacob died?
No.
What was the promise to Jacob when Jacob agreed to the covenant? Let's go look. This, of course, would be Jacob and his ladder, right? That's the discussion, or that's the area in which we would be looking, right? And in principle, then we would encounter that covenant as he flees from Isaac, right? Well, not flees from Isaac, but he flees from Esau after he gets the blessing from Isaac. Okay? All right. So then we know that Jacob has this dream, right? He departs from Beersheba and goes to Haran, and happened upon a particular place and spent the night there because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and made it a support for his head and lay down in that place. He had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set up upon the earth, and with its top reaching to the heavens, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Propose that's the light of Passover, but we'll get over it. Then behold, Yahweh was standing above it and said, I am Yahweh, the Elohim of your father Avraham, and the Elohim of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and your descendants, you and your seed, and your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in you and in your descendants shall the families of the earth be blessed. Right? Behold, I am with you. I will keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done all that I have promised you. Okay? So, let's just talk about this now. I will not leave you until I've done all that I promised you. And one of the things I promised you is that your descendants would spread out from the boundaries of the original boundaries given to Abraham in Israel, in the promised land. So until truly inherited land equals to Jacob's descendants, and they cross the borders of that land into other lands as an expansion, the promise of Jacob has not been completed. Therefore, Yahweh would not leave him until then. Meaning what? He goes down to Egypt with that promise. His descendants go down to Egypt with that promise. Meaning what? They were Israel from the moment that Jacob received that name as a covenant promise. Meaning what? 400 years of slavery is completely irrelevant to the process. Identity as a slave, completely irrelevant to the process. These people who were in this land, who were under this subjection, who were completely broken and torn down and removed from their identity in their minds, still had their identity. Or Yahweh's a liar. And so people who think that Israel became a nation when they came out of Egypt don't understand what really happened at Mount Sinai. And I propose to you that one of the more important questions we need to ask is, what does that mean for us today? That means that regardless of how screwed up you are, regardless of how off the wall your life is going right now, you have an identity that is irrelevant to circumstance, irrelevant to your opinion, irrelevant to your belief in your identity. So what a glorious thing to have an opportunity before Passover to become that identity through a deep bow of self. And I propose to you that although we're only halfway done with this current session of Midrash Rabbah 2.0, part 2, we have arrived at a climax of this parasha without even touching upon the deliverance itself, without even touching upon the actual Passover itself, Pesach, or the word avar, which is Passover. We have not even touched upon the connection to Abraham and Vayira. We haven't even touched upon the fact that there is something being communicated here about Egypt that when you get it and really grasp it, it will touch you in a way you have never, ever realized before. That Egypt is in the eye of the beholder. That the Egypt that Israel needed deliverance from was the same Egypt that Israel went down when they were being saved by Joseph. The same place. Bindings. So on one side, the bindings have a light purpose. On the other side, the bindings have a dark purpose. Now, the intrigue of this is going to arise when we realize that if their identity was intact, how on earth did they ever become slaves? If the promise was still present, how on earth did they ever become slaves? I propose to you that the secret to that information is actually within this story. That quite literally, they eventually gave in to the infestation. Now, I propose to you that after the Midrash, in which we discussed the systemic idolatry and we discussed the cycle of Israel from the point of view of what happened in Judges, and we discuss the concept of the Yeshua principle, that we concluded that it could not have necessarily been systemic idolatry, but instead just literally a wearing down of their identity, which does include infestation, does include compromise, but also includes way too much exposure to darkness. Not as a choice like, oh, I want to go play and dabble in the stuff, but forgetting to self-care, forgetting to reset, forgetting to bask in the light of Passover, forgetting to align yourself, forgetting to connect, forgetting to rely upon the intuition of the higher self. Identity worked over time without protection will result in a false identity. And a false identity raising itself up in the power of an Elohim is a false god, like Pharaoh. So, how about we stop being so afraid of the claim that we are gods when Moses was a god and Pharaoh was a god? And that was the language that had to be spoken in order for Pharaoh to understand. And that was the language that had to be spoken by Moses, not Yahweh. Yahweh could not speak to Pharaoh. So what's interesting is Yahweh sends Moses in and speaks Pharaoh's language. Boy, if you guys could get the depth of that. It's almost as if we have been given in this parasha a list of tools that, depending on how you use them, makes it darkness or light, makes it good or evil, makes it right or wrong. In other words, the power is there. How are you going to use it? The authority is there. How are you going to use it? I will go back to my reference from the first part in which I said Yahweh will position a person in a state of absolute adversity so that they will look at that adversity and cry out to him for that adversity to be removed, which is why he's put them there in the first place, and so that a human would bear witness, just like Lot. Remember, it says in Peter that Lot's righteous soul was vexed daily because of Sodom and Gomorrah. And we wonder where the cry came from. But Lot had to live among them first and then cry out. He had to develop relationships. He was an elder amongst them and a judge.
We know that because he was at the gate.
Mm-hmm. And because they accused him of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, is identity the biggest issue here? Yes, of course. That's a given. Christianity chose an identity outside of Torah. Judaism chose an identity outside of Yeshua. For those agnostics who are watching, you chose an identity outside of both of those things instead of embracing the depth of, for lack of a better word, structure into a chaotic system. Literally, order into being introduced into a chaotic system. Identifying and accepting entropy, but realizing not realizing that is actually what this story is about. I will leave that to your imaginations on why that's true. Now, the next thing on the agenda for this particular parasha, or the next thing scheduled in the parasha, is the death of the firstborn, the 10th plague. I will propose to you that particular plague is an absolute reciprocation upon what Pharaoh did himself to the Hebrews. I want you to think about this in your world for a moment. Because whether you are just extremely blessed and you liberally identify with suffering, what I mean by that is that you would basically acknowledge that your life is not really included any suffering, and that there's actually a mechanism of you having to look very far away from you to see the suffering. That's what I mean by liberally, that you expand your mind to see the suffering of others versus the focus or the inappropriate lens of seeing injustices as being not in your backyard, but identifying with them, as opposed to injustices that are occurring in your own life. So what I mean by that is that there are some people who are really, really blessed, and they identify that any adversity that they experience is external to them and a ways out. But then there's those who are busy looking at the injustices around them instead of realizing the injustices in their own life. And then there's those who have injustices in their own life. This is what I want you to think about. The context of a adversity being the dysfunctional element by which a person begins to abandon their identity is directly tied into that maintenance of that identity. Now, in principle, one of the things that we probably need to get into here is when you are suffering, you can develop a hardness of heart to your suffering in such a way that you become hardened in your heart to others' suffering. So, in principle, it can be suffering for so long that you actually no longer acknowledge suffering. What's worse is then an observation of other people's suffering will be identified as, at least it's not happening to me, or even worse, accepting other people's suffering because it's not you. So then, however it works out, justice begins to turn on its head. Meaning that you would actually be okay with somebody else suffering as long as it's not you, and maybe even allow yourself to benefit from it. Which is where we find the Egyptian people at the moment until this council after the locust plague. But what I really want you to get your mind wrapped around is that when injustice is perceived, the first mechanism of the human psyche is to remedy the injustice. And I will also propose to you that one of the things that has to occur in any given situation is either a self-adjustment of an undone deed or an external adjustment of that undone deed. What do I mean? I mean that before the hardening of your heart towards injustice occurs, there's a desire for vindication. There is a built-in mechanism in humanity that says that an injustice is an incongruity and therefore a cognitive dissonance, and therefore a discomfort, and therefore we will move away from discomfort. And when we move away from discomfort, we will tend towards comfort. So injustice makes us uncomfortable. It creates an incongruity. It is not right. And every human being is the light. But as there is a lack of maintenance upon that light, as injustice begins to occur, there's an undoneness to it. And one of the problems we have is that when we are given an opportunity to move forward, we will get stuck in that which is not complete. And being stuck within that which is not complete will prevent you from moving forward. Which means, what do we have? Well, first of all, we have the people of Egypt finding the Hebrew slaves' suffering as acceptable because it's not them. Remember how it was reversed before. The people of Egypt were the slaves under Pharaoh. As a result of indentured service, as a result of selling their labor, future labor, for present sustenance under Joseph. Then doing what? Then shifting to suffering under the new king of the Hebrews. thereby finding it justifiable to have the Hebrews in slavery in your midst. Listen, guys, this is the direct mechanism by which people's thinking operated the way they did in the slavery that occurred in the United States. Better them than me. At least I'm not suffering, and I will find this acceptable because I'm not suffering, because I could be if I didn't have this. It's an absolute ego trip, but here's the thing. The Israelites, now pay attention to this now, because remember, this particular Passover, not the one in March, is an internal locus of control, should you choose to operate in it, versus an external locus of control, which is absolute instruction from Torah to do the thing. Doesn't mean you can't approach the March one with an attitude of already having the Passover within you and therefore not needing the commandment like Abraham. Abraham did not need a written Torah in order to activate Torah. Nor did any of the Israelites. The Torah was written for the nations. That's what Paul said. Now, why is that so important? Because now all of a sudden we understand they could not leave Egypt with the undone thing. They could not cease from their identity without there being a vengeance upon the firstborn of Egypt. They could not leave Egypt as a new being other than a slave without first experiencing a vindication from their suffering. And that vindication was beyond just them being indentured servants. I know they weren't indentured servants, but that is how it's defined in the Hebrew for the word oved. You see, oved just means obedient. It's where we get obedencia or obedience, right? Is oved. And oved is a slave, or is it? It's an indentured servant. Well, that makes more sense. It's not a servant, right? It's not somebody who voluntarily or is hired to work and clean your home. It is somebody who owes you money and cleans your home and grows your crops and raises your children. It is not ownership of another human being. It's ownership of their debt. If you're curious about that, go get your credit report and find out who owns your debt, because that is actually slavery, according to the word oved. But with Pharaoh, something else has happened, right? There's been a manipulation of that economy. There's been a manipulation of indentured service. Somehow Israel had become joined to Pharaoh. And I have a whole teaching, I don't know, I think it's in the archives, I don't think it's in the videos on YouTube. I have a whole teaching on how it was not an involuntary process by which they were in slavery, and that it was military related. That their service was actually in the military protection of Egypt. And that was one of the reasons why the advisors tell Pharaoh, do not let the people go, because we will lose our protection. But the children of Israel could not leave without there being an answer to the question about their children. Does it satisfy the conscience to have the firstborn of Egypt die? No, it put the absolute fear of God in the children of Israel. But truth be told, is it had to occur because something was left undone. They would leave Egypt with that understanding that that was left undone, that they needed to avenge their children. and they would return to the land when they were strong. Now they had no reason to return. They left Egypt with riches and gold and clothing as if they were royalty leaving the land.
And justice being done.
They had no reason to return to Egypt. Justice was accomplished, etc. Furthermore, they had proof of faith.
Well, what you just, a few moments ago, you had mentioned how Lot was the one that was crying out. And before that Passover, we know that that's Passover because Abraham gives Yahweh a fatted calf and
Unleavened bread.
And well, it's Lot that gives him unleavened bread.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
But Lot gives the two angels or the two men, the messengers, the unleavened bread, and how here in this Passover, in this Parasha's Passover season, they had been crying out for their children, crying out not just because of the slavery, but because, the loss of their children and so forth and so on. And it makes me think that this season, now in January this year, before we come up to Passover, we need to be crying out for any of those injustices that may be occurring in our lives. The things that are undone or unsaid or not put right.
I want to add something to this. Because I don't think anybody would ever view, especially those people who are opponents of the Bible, the Exodus and Passover as an act of mercy. When they first began to try to find proof of the Exodus, biblically motivated archaeologists trying to find some sort of artifact proof of the Exodus, they searched and searched and searched and found no proof of the Hebrews, no proof of Israelite slaves, no proof of anything to indicate that there was ever an Exodus. And of course, the opponents of the Bible had a heyday. We'd already gone through the Renaissance and through the Age of Enlightenment, and therefore had been released from the slavery of religion for science. Remember, the Catholic Church used to control the science of the world, right? Demanding that certain sciences be reconciled to their particular flavor of religion. And so science is delivered from the bias of the church, and all that's already occurred, and now all of a sudden they're looking, and so these opponents of the Bible are like, yay, we found it, we found no proof of the Exodus, therefore we can prove the Bible doesn't need it, blah, blah, blah. And somebody got a bright idea to re-examine, I think it was Jericho specifically. I can't remember that completely, but the premise is that basically they shifted the timeline and they found everything, including Joseph's tomb. But what they found that was so powerful was that there was not a place where dirt was moved that they did not find a skeleton. That place, which would have been known as Goshen, and its surrounding area was foot for foot covered in skeletons. To the extent that they concluded that when it said, because there were no graves in Egypt, God brought us out into the wilderness to die, they were not lying. There was nowhere left to bury a body. meaning all of Egypt could have died, not just the firstborn, women, men, children, and their immediate families, and the graves would have never been satisfied. If 610,000 men on the age of 20 of war left on foot, and we say that maybe another percentage of that is women and children, equaling about 1.2 million people left Egypt, how many died? And how many Egyptians should have died as a vindication on behalf of the people? But instead, only the firstborn dies. A mercy. An opportunity for the Egyptian people to go back and reset. They could go back and they could reset their families through what? Another firstborn.
Well,
right?
The firstborn is supposed to be significant of your strength, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So they would be able to reset only weaker or less strengthened.
At the very least, an attitude readjustment, because
Exactly.
now
That's
the intensification of all power in the universe has just put the smackdoodle on your nation, both in economy and infrastructure, and now in birth rate population support. You might have a little bit more respect for the guy, right? But the premise is that he only kills the firstborn, which gives them an opportunity to reset the birth rate, reset the crops, reset everything. It says even the livestock firstborn died, which means there was still livestock available. Everything could have been reset. And truth be told, is Egypt survives long after that time period as a nation of power. Meaning somebody did a reset. Mercy. I will prove it to you. Egypt was still in power and in all of its knowledge and wisdom and sacred wisdom and medical science in all the things during Solomon's lifetime. Meaning what? Meaning, well, let me just compare contrast. The Hittites were wiped out before Solomon's lifetime. The Hittites were one of the nations that it says in Judges that Yahweh left in the land so that Israel could learn war. And the Hittites, according to archaeology, were wiped out before Solomon. Or somewhere in it. But my point is that Egypt supersedes Hittites. Because it was only the firstborn. It was only the firstborn who was killed. What is instructed to Joshua when he is to go into the land of Canaan? Leave no one alive. So see, there's something that people miss here. That Egypt has some sort of place in Yahweh's heart. We may never know what that is. What if the previous cycle of creation, Egypt was Israel? Who knows? But the premise is throughout. Look in Zechariah chapter 14. The nations who survived will have plagues like Egypt. Look at the book of Revelation, where there is a reference to Egypt. the firstborn appears to be a malevolent, dark god until you read the book of Yasher, the book of Jubilees, and the Bible, and contextually conclude that Pharaoh was about as bad as Hitler. And that the unaliving of the Hebrews in such a way that there was no room in the land for a grave pegs the death of the firstborn as a mercy, as a gentleness, a nudge towards reset. So in that way, I think that we can make an adjustment here in our minds to say two very important things. Number one, we see Moses praying for his enemy to be relieved of their plague, knowing that there is a later destruction of the enemy coming, because Yahweh said they will drive them out before it's done. I will harden Pharaoh's heart until he drives them out. And just like was said during lunch today, that the people needed to be driven out in order for their hearts to adjust correctly to the fact that they were no longer welcome in the land of Egypt, because there was an adjustment to the land of Egypt. There was a connection to the flesh pots and the onions and the leeks and the garlic. They kind of were attached to the brisket. So when we are looking at this story, we have a tendency to make the mistake of just having the hindsight deliver us into the next part of the narrative. And we just float right through the plagues, down the river, never stopping to realize the ramifications that this narrative is in a book known, pay attention, as God's teaching and instruction. Torah. That's what Torah means. Teaching, not law, not commandments, not external locus of control. You want to know why the parasha is behind? Because it wants you to examine your heart before you get to March and April. It wants you to be in a position of identity when you get to March and April. It wants you to take this story and be Pharaoh, but do the right thing. It wants you to take this story and be Moses, but pray for your enemy. It wants you to take this story and be Yahweh and give a mercy to a vindication that clearly, by archaeological evidence, should have been much more severe. And I pity the nation who does what Pharaoh did when it comes time for the harbinger and the prophet to enter the land. What a beautiful illustration of the fact that Egypt was never merited in the relationship interaction between Yahweh and it. A nation, not Israel, but a nation who was not in covenant with him was saved from plagues. But then later on, those same plagues caused that nation to fall. And you don't think Torah is for the nations. Because by what judgment was Yahweh determining that nation should be preserved or fall? But the treatment of his people. You guys want a little bit of a head wrecker? Remember when Abraham goes into the land of Canaan and fights Chedorlaomer and takes control of the land of Canaan because Chedorlaomer dies, and that which you beat in battle becomes yours by possession. He gives a tenth of those spoils to Melchizedek and meets Melchizedek in the land of the kings because he's now king. And here comes Sodom as a king in parley with Abraham and says, you can have the spoils, I just want the people. And Abraham says, no, you take those spoils and you give them to my friends Honor, Eshcol, and Mamre. Did it ever cross anybody's mind that because Honor, Eshcol, and Mamre were in covenant with Abraham, that that's why those spoils existed? A reward for those who were friends with Abraham. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. Did it ever occur that when Pharaoh blessed Abraham with riches, he preserved his nation during the famines when the famines came that caused Joseph to have to deliver them? Did it ever register that that is why Yahweh chose Egypt for his people during the famine? Is so that he could bless Egypt. We don't know why. We don't know what the big deal with Egypt is, but I can propose to you that there is something to do with the name of Egypt and how it is used as a tool in the lives of a human being in covenant with his people.
Meaning the two bindings, right?
The two bindings. And you guys know I've already demonstrated you the responsibility of the bride and the need for the binding and all the other stuff. So as we come to the end of this session, realize that this is Torah. This is God's teaching and instruction, and there is instruction in this parasha to do certain things and to use certain things a certain way and to rely on certain promises and to stay within identities and maintain identities and not compromise and allow infestation and compromise and allow ego, to prepare your heart as an internal locus of control for the Passover that you don't need to have written down. You don't need to be told to do the things of Passover, just like Abraham didn't. Because he's the father of all who believe, who are circumcised or uncircumcised. Because what? A keeping of the commandments shows that you are circumcised. A non-keeping of the commandments shows that you are uncircumcised, even if you are circumcised. And what is circumcision? Circumcision is the guarantee to the promised land of Abraham. A land that has yet to have had his descendants occupy to the extent of the borders and spread beyond the borders. Ever. Not even Solomon did it. And Solomon did some crazy expansion. So as we get ready to close this session, and we'll come back and we'll do a third session, I think it is very important that we pay attention to the fact that all of this, these plagues, these interactions between Moses and Pharaoh, these interactions between Yahweh and Moses, and these interactions between Yahweh and Egypt and Goshen are instruction. Instruction for us as Elohim, instruction for us as prophets, instruction for us as priests, instruction for us as kings, instruction for us as people who have the spirit and not the letter of the law. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.